It was a bright Tuesday morning when 72-year-old Martha Wilson decided it was finally time to replace her old car. The faithful sedan that had carried her to countless grocery trips, doctor appointments, and visits to her grandchildren had finally given up after 15 years of service. The mechanic had shaken his head the day before, telling her that fixing it would cost more than the car was worth. Martha had never been one to make hasty decisions, especially when it came to spending money. Growing up in a family where every penny counted had taught her the value of careful consideration. But she also knew when it was time to be practical. Without a car, she would become dependent on others for transportation, something that went against her fiercely independent nature. After a simple breakfast of toast and tea, Martha changed out of her nightgown and put on what she considered her everyday clothes. A pair of comfortable beige slacks that had seen better days, a faded blue button-up shirt, and her trusty gardening sneakers. She hadn't planned on car shopping when she dressed that morning. Her original plan had been to spend the day tending to her beloved rose garden, but the call from the mechanic had changed everything. "I'll just go look," she told herself as she grabbed her worn leather purse, the one her husband Robert had given her for their 30th anniversary. No need to dress fancy just to browse. The Lux Motors dealership wasn't Martha's first choice. She had always purchased practical, affordable vehicles from the family-owned lot on the other side of town. But her grandson Thomas had suggested she treat herself to something nicer this time around. "You deserve a bit of luxury, Gran," he'd said during their weekly phone call. "You and Grandpa have saved all your lives. It's okay to spend a little on yourself now." Martha smiled at the memory as she drove her neighbor's borrowed car into the gleaming lot of Lux Motors. The dealership was impressive, with its glass-fronted showroom and rows of shiny vehicles catching the sun. Cars that cost more than what she and Robert had paid for their first house stood proudly on display, their polished surfaces reflecting the cloudless sky. For a moment, Martha sat in the borrowed car feeling suddenly out of place. Perhaps this had been a mistake. These cars weren't for people like her, practical people who valued function over flash. But then she remembered what Robert always said. "We might live simply, but that's our choice, not our limitation." With renewed determination, Martha stepped out of the car and straightened her shirt. Age had bent her frame slightly, making her once 5'6" stature appear smaller, more fragile. But anyone who knew Martha understood that her appearance was deceiving. She had raised 3 children while working full-time as a schoolteacher. She had nursed Robert through a serious illness 10 years ago, when doctors had given him slim chances. Martha Wilson was many things, but fragile wasn't one of them. The automatic doors of the showroom slid open with a soft whoosh, welcoming her into a world of luxury. The air inside smelled of new leather and expensive cologne. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. About half a dozen customers wandered around, admiring the vehicles on display. Most were dressed in business attire or designer casual wear. Martha suddenly felt even more conscious of her gardening sneakers. A young woman at the reception desk glanced up as Martha entered, her eyes doing a quick assessment before returning to her computer screen without acknowledgement. Martha didn't mind. She preferred to look around by herself first anyway. She wandered through the showroom, taking her time to examine different models. She wasn't entirely sure what she wanted, but she knew she needed something reliable, good on gas and easy to handle. Her eyes were drawn to a mid-sized sedan in a deep blue color, not too flashy, but certainly nicer than anything she had owned before. As Martha circled the vehicle, reading the information card placed on its windshield, she noticed a salesman nearby. He was a tall man in his 30s with carefully styled hair and a crisp white shirt. His name tag read Brad. He was speaking animatedly with a younger couple looking at a luxury SUV, his hands moving expressively as he highlighted features and benefits. Martha waited patiently, not wanting to interrupt. When the couple moved on to discuss the car between themselves, she approached Brad with a polite smile. "Excuse me," she said. "I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about this sedan?" Brad's smile faltered slightly as he turned to look at her. His eyes, much like the receptionist's had done, quickly took in her appearance. The worn slacks, the faded shirt, the old sneakers, the weathered hands that spoke of decades of hard work. "This particular model?" he asked, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been with the young couple. "It starts at $55,000. The way he emphasized the price made his meaning clear. This car was beyond her means. But what Brad didn't know was that Martha and Robert had lived frugally their entire lives despite Robert's success in investment banking. They had put 3 children through college without loans, paid off their mortgage early, and accumulated significant savings. The price of the car, while certainly more than Martha had ever spent on a vehicle before, was well within her budget. "That's fine," Martha replied calmly. "Could you tell me about its safety features? And how does it handle in winter conditions?" Brad glanced over her shoulder, his attention clearly caught by a man in an expensive suit who had just entered the showroom. "Look," he said, turning back to Martha with barely concealed impatience. "Why don't you check out the information sheet? I'll be back in a bit." Without waiting for her response, he strode toward the man in the suit, his hand already extended in greeting, his voice once again warm and engaging. "Welcome to Lux Motors. How can I help you today?" Martha stood there for a moment, stunned by the abrupt dismissal. In all her 72 years, she had rarely been treated with such obvious disregard. She looked down at the glossy brochure she had picked up, suddenly feeling out of place among the sleek, expensive cars. Still, Martha was not one to give up easily. Perhaps Brad was just having a bad day, or maybe he really did need to attend to the other customer urgently. She decided to continue looking at the sedan that had caught her eye. After all, she would be the one driving it, not the salesperson. 20 minutes passed as Martha carefully examined the car, even sitting inside to test the comfort of the seats and the visibility from the driver's position. The interior smelled of new leather and had all sorts of buttons and screens that her old car lacked. It was certainly a step up in terms of technology, but Martha felt confident she could learn to use the new features. She had, after all, mastered the smartphone her grandchildren had insisted she get. When Brad showed no signs of returning, Martha decided to seek help elsewhere. She noticed another salesperson, a woman who appeared to be in her 50s, but she was deeply engaged with customers of her own. Finally, Martha approached the reception desk. "Excuse me?" she said to the young woman who had ignored her earlier. "I'm interested in the blue sedan, but Brad seems quite busy. Is there someone else who could help me?" The receptionist looked up, her expression making it clear that Martha was interrupting something important. "You could wait for Brad," she suggested, her tone indicating that waiting was exactly what Martha should do. "Or I could call the sales manager if it's urgent." "The sales manager would be fine," Martha said, maintaining her politeness despite the receptionist's attitude. "I'm ready to discuss purchase options." The receptionist's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly at this, but she picked up her phone and pressed a button. "Derek," she said into the receiver, "there's a customer asking for assistance with the C-Class sedan." The slight pause before the word customer was subtle but noticeable. A few minutes later, Derek appeared from an office at the back of the showroom. He was a heavyset man with a red face and thinning hair, dressed in an expensive suit that seemed slightly too tight around the middle. His smile was practiced but didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you're interested in one of our vehicles," he said, approaching Martha. Like Brad, his gaze took in her casual attire, and like Brad, he seemed to make immediate assumptions. "Yes," Martha replied, choosing to ignore his evaluating look. "The blue sedan. I'm considering purchasing it today if we can agree on terms. I'd like to know more about the warranty options and—" Derek interrupted her with a raised hand. "Ma'am, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. That particular model might not be suitable for your needs or budget. We have some used vehicles at our sister location that might be more appropriate." Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from a slow-burning anger. "There's no misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady despite her feelings. "I'm interested in that sedan, and I'm prepared to pay cash today if the terms are right." Derek exchanged a glance with the receptionist, who didn't bother to hide her smirk. The exchange wasn't lost on Martha, who had spent decades observing the subtle communications between school children trying to get away with mischief. "Look," Derek said, his voice now carrying across the showroom floor, drawing the attention of nearby customers. "I've been in this business for 20 years. I know when someone is wasting my time. That car costs more than some people make in a year. I think you'd be more comfortable at the used car lot down the street." The showroom had grown quiet. Other customers were watching the interaction, some with discomfort, others with the slightly guilty interest of those witnessing a public spectacle. Martha felt the weight of their stares, along with a humiliation she hadn't experienced since she was a young girl being scolded in front of her class for a mistake on the blackboard. For a brief moment, she considered standing her ground, telling this pompous man exactly who she was and what she could afford. She thought about mentioning Robert, whose quiet success in the early days of Silicon Valley had set them up for a comfortable retirement that most people could only dream of. She thought about pulling out the black credit card tucked into her worn purse, the one that had no spending limit. But Martha Wilson had never been one to make a scene or to feel the need to prove herself to people who had already decided who she was based on appearances. With dignity that Derek couldn't begin to understand, she simply nodded once. "I see," she said quietly. "Thank you for your time." With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, her back straight despite the burning shame she felt. As the automatic doors closed behind her, she heard laughter from inside. Whether real or imagined, it cut deep all the same. The walk across the parking lot felt longer than it should have. Martha clutched her purse tightly against her side as she made her way to the borrowed car, fighting to maintain her composure. She had always prided herself on dignity, on never letting others see when they had hurt her. It was a lesson learned in childhood and reinforced through 7 decades of life's ups and downs. But now, alone in the safety of her neighbor's car, Martha's hands trembled as she placed them on the steering wheel. The humiliation washed over her in waves, bringing with it memories of other times when people had judged her without knowing her story. The young bank teller who had questioned her ability to understand a simple transaction, the doctor who had spoken over her head to Robert, as if age had stolen her ability to comprehend her own medical condition, the shop assistant who had followed her around a high-end store, clearly suspecting she might steal something. It shouldn't still hurt, Martha whispered to herself, a single tear escaping despite her best efforts. She quickly wiped it away, annoyed at her own vulnerability. Not at my age. She sat there for several minutes, collecting herself before starting the engine. Martha had never been one for self-pity, and she wouldn't start now. With a deep breath, she backed out of the parking space and drove away from Lux Motors, determined to put the unpleasant experience behind her. The drive home took 20 minutes, through neighborhoods that had transformed over the decades she and Robert had lived in the city. What had once been open fields were now shopping centers. Small family homes had been torn down to make way for luxury apartments. The city had grown up around them, while they had remained in the colonial-style house they had purchased when Robert's career was just beginning to take off. Their home stood on a tree-lined street in what had become one of the city's most established neighborhoods. Unlike many of their friends who had downsized after retirement, Martha and Robert had chosen to stay. The house had raised 3 children, hosted countless holiday gatherings, and sheltered them through life's storms. Its walls held their history. As Martha pulled into the driveway, she noticed Robert was out in the garden, tending to the vegetable patch that had become his pride and joy since retirement. At 75, he moved more slowly than he once had, but he still insisted on growing their tomatoes and peppers, claiming that store-bought varieties couldn't compare. Robert looked up as she parked, his weathered face breaking into the smile that still made Martha's heart skip after 50 years of marriage. He stood, brushing soil from his knees, his curiosity evident. She wasn't supposed to be home so soon. "That was quick," he called as she got out of the car. "Did they not have anything you liked?" Martha considered for a brief moment, not telling him about what had happened. Robert had always been protective, sometimes overly so. The last thing she wanted was to upset him. But in 50 years they had never kept secrets from each other, and she wasn't about to start now. "The cars were fine," she replied, trying to keep her voice light. "The people, not so much." Robert's smile faded as he approached, garden gloves dangling from one hand. He knew his wife too well not to notice the slight strain in her voice, the unusual tightness around her eyes. "What happened?" he asked simply. Martha sighed, linking her arm through his as they walked toward the house. "Let's go inside. I could use a cup of tea." Their kitchen was the heart of their home, warm and lived in with its oak cabinets that Robert had insisted on building himself decades ago. Martha filled the kettle while Robert washed his hands at the sink. It was their usual routine, comfortable in its familiarity. "They didn't think I belonged there," Martha said finally, measuring tea leaves into the pot. She didn't need to specify who they were. The salesman took one look at me and decided I couldn't afford anything on their lot. Robert frowned, drying his hands on a dish towel. That doesn't sound right. Oh, it gets better, Martha continued, the words coming more easily now. When I insisted on speaking with a manager, he practically threw me out. In front of everyone. Her voice caught slightly at the memory, the public humiliation still fresh. Robert's expression darkened, a look Martha had rarely seen during their long marriage. Robert had always been the calm one, the peacemaker. In their early years together, when Martha's temper flared hot and quick, it was Robert who would diffuse situations with quiet words and gentle humor. But there was nothing gentle in his eyes now. Who were these people? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. What were their names? It doesn't matter, Martha said, pouring hot water over the tea leaves. I'm not going back there, that's all. I'll try the place where we bought my last car. It matters to me, Robert insisted. He pulled out a chair at their kitchen table and sat down heavily. You don't spend 50 years building a life with someone and then just let them be treated that way. Martha brought the teapot to the table, along with 2 of the blue willow-patterned cups they'd received as wedding gifts all those years ago. Only 4 remained from the original set of 12, survivors of children's careless hands and decades of daily use. The salesman's name tag said Brad. She relented. The manager was Derek, but really, Robert, let's just forget about it. People make assumptions. It's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last. That doesn't make it right. Robert's fingers drummed against the table, a sure sign he was upset. What was the name of this place again? Lux Motors, Martha replied, pouring the tea. She added a touch of honey to Robert's cup just as he liked it. But please, let's drop it. I don't want you getting all worked up. Remember what Dr. Patterson said about your blood pressure? Robert accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, but Martha could see he wasn't ready to let the matter rest. She recognized the look in his eyes, the same determined expression he had worn when fighting for a promotion he deserved, when standing up to their son's unfair teacher, when negotiating with the contractor who had tried to overcharge them for home repairs. Tell me exactly what happened, he said after taking a sip of tea. From the beginning, Martha sighed but complied. She described entering the dealership, being ignored by the receptionist, Brad's dismissive attitude, and finally, Derek's humiliating comments. As she spoke, she watched Robert's face grow increasingly still, a calmness that she knew from experience was more concerning than any outburst. When she finished, they sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall, a wedding gift from Robert's parents. 55 years, Robert said finally. What's that? Martha asked, confused by the apparent non sequitur. 55 years I've worked, starting from that paper route when I was 12, all through college, then Silicon Valley when nobody knew what it would become. He stared into his tea as if seeing those years reflected in its amber depths. I worked 60-hour weeks for decades, missed ball games and school plays, made tough calls and tougher investments. Martha reached across the table to take his hand. You were always there when it mattered most. Robert squeezed her fingers gently. My point is that we earned everything we have. Nobody handed us anything. And after all that work, after all these years, my wife gets thrown out of a car dealership because she doesn't look the part? It's their loss, Martha said softly. They missed out on a sale. It's more than that, Robert replied, a hint of steel in his voice. It's about respect. It's about seeing people for who they are, not what they're wearing or how they look. Martha knew that tone. It was rare but unmistakable. What are you thinking of doing? Nothing drastic, Robert assured her, though the glint in his eye suggested otherwise. Just a little reminder about judging books by their covers. Martha studied her husband's face, noting the set of his jaw, the resolute look that had carried him through business challenges that would have defeated lesser men. She knew better than to try to dissuade him when he got like this. Just promise me you won't do anything foolish, she said finally. We're too old for dramatics. Robert's expression softened and the familiar gentle smile returned. When have I ever been foolish? Martha raised an eyebrow and they both laughed, the tension broken. Shall I list the occasions chronologically or alphabetically? She teased. After finishing their tea, they moved to the living room where Robert insisted Martha sit while he made a few phone calls. She pretended to focus on her knitting, a sweater for their youngest grandchild, but couldn't help overhearing snippets of his conversations. First, a call to their son Michael in Boston, followed by one to their daughter Patricia in Chicago. Both calls were brief but intense, with Robert doing more listening than talking. Next came a longer call to someone named Howard, a name Martha vaguely recognized as one of Robert's old business associates. Finally, he called their lawyer, Franklin, who had handled their affairs for the past 30 years. This conversation involved more technical terms, references to holdings and investments that Martha had never bothered to understand fully. Robert had always managed their finances, though he kept her informed of the big picture. When he finally rejoined her, Robert seemed more relaxed, almost cheerful. "Beautiful evening," he commented, looking out at their garden where the setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn. "How about we order in dinner tonight? That Italian place you like?" Martha gave him a knowing look. "You're changing the subject." Robert's innocently raised eyebrows didn't fool her for a second. "Can't a man suggest Italian food without an ulterior motive? Not when that man is you and not after those phone calls." Martha set her knitting aside. "What are you planning, Robert?" "Just a bit of research," he replied casually. "Turns out Howard's nephew works for the parent company that owns Lux Motors. Small world, isn't it?" Martha shook her head but couldn't suppress a small smile. "Very small. And the calls to Michael and Patricia? Just checking their schedules. They might be coming to visit soon." Robert sat beside her on the sofa, taking her hand in his. "Now about that Italian food." Martha decided to let the matter drop for now. Whatever Robert was planning, he would tell her when he was ready. After 50 years together, she had learned when to push and when to wait. "Italian sounds perfect," she agreed. "But I'm not eating garlic bread. Last time I had heartburn all night." "Noted," Robert said with a grin. "No garlic bread for the lady." As they sat together waiting for their dinner delivery, Martha found the sting of the afternoon's humiliation fading. She still felt its echo, but here in their home, with Robert's hand warm in hers, it seemed less important somehow. What she didn't know was that while she was beginning to forget the incident, Robert was quietly setting a plan in motion that would ensure Brad and Derek would remember Martha Wilson for a very long time to come. Martha woke early the next morning, as she had nearly every day of her adult life. Decades of rising before dawn to prepare for school had ingrained the habit so deeply that even retirement couldn't break it. She lay still for a moment, listening to Robert's gentle snoring beside her. Usually she would slip quietly out of bed to start her day, but something about the events of yesterday made her linger. She studied her husband's face in the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. Time had etched its story on his features, lines around his eyes from years of laughter, furrows in his brow from moments of concentration and concern. His hair, once a rich brown, was now a distinguished silver. Yet when she looked at him, Martha still saw glimpses of the confident young man who had asked her to dance at a college mixer all those years ago. Robert stirred, as if sensing her gaze. His eyes opened, immediately finding hers. "You're staring," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. "Just admiring the view," Martha replied with a small smile. Robert chuckled, reaching out to tuck a strand of white hair behind her ear. "Flatterer." He glanced at the clock on the bedside table. "It's early. Everything okay?" Martha nodded, though in truth she had slept poorly. The memory of standing in that showroom, feeling small and insignificant under the judgmental gazes of Brad and Derek, had played on repeat in her mind. "I'm fine," she said. "Just thinking about finding a car. I might try that place over on Maple Street today." Robert sat up, suddenly more awake. "Actually, I have a better idea. Why don't we go together? I need to run a few errands downtown anyway." There was something in his tone that made Martha suspicious. "What errands?" "Just some banking things. Investment stuff." Robert waved his hand vaguely, already getting out of bed. "Nothing interesting." Martha knew her husband well enough to recognize when he was being deliberately evasive. "This wouldn't have anything to do with yesterday, would it?" "Can a man offer to go car shopping with his wife?" Robert asked, the picture of innocence as he pulled on his robe. "We can make a day of it. Have lunch at that little bistro you like." Martha wasn't fooled, but she decided to play along. Whatever Robert was planning, she knew from experience that trying to stop him would be futile. Besides, she was curious. "All right," she agreed. "But I'm not going back to Lux Motors." "Wouldn't dream of suggesting it," Robert assured her, though Martha couldn't help noticing he didn't actually promise they wouldn't end up there. After breakfast, Martha changed into one of her nicer outfits, not because of yesterday's experience, she told herself firmly, but simply because she wanted to. The pale blue dress had been a gift from Patricia last Christmas, and the matching cardigan was practical for the slightly cool morning. She added her pearl earrings, a 35th anniversary present from Robert, and a light touch of lipstick. When she came downstairs, she found Robert dressed in what their grandchildren called his serious business attire. A tailored charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, and his favorite blue silk tie. Martha raised her eyebrows. "Banking errands, she commented dryly. Robert adjusted his cufflinks, gold ones engraved with his initials, another anniversary gift from long ago. "I like to look presentable." "Is that a crime?" "Not at all," Martha replied, hiding her amusement, "though I'm not sure many people wear Savile Row suits to make a deposit at the local bank." "You never know who you might run into," Robert said, offering her his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. "Shall we?" Instead of the practical sedan they typically used for errands, Robert led Martha to the garage where his Rolls-Royce Phantom sat under a custom cover. The luxury car had been a 60th birthday present to himself, a rare indulgence from a man who typically cared little for displays of wealth. He used it so seldom that many of their neighbors didn't even know they owned it. "Robert," Martha said warningly as he removed the cover, "what exactly are you up to?" "Just felt like taking her out for a spin," he replied, running a hand lovingly over the gleaming hood. "She needs the exercise now and then." Martha sighed but didn't argue. The car was beautiful, she had to admit, with its classic lines and handcrafted details. Robert opened the passenger door for her, and she settled into the buttery soft leather seat. As they backed out of the driveway, Martha noticed Mrs. Peterson from next door pausing in her gardening to stare. The elderly neighbor gave a hesitant wave, clearly surprised to see the Wilsons in such an ostentatious vehicle. "You're causing a scene," Martha noted, waving back at Mrs. Peterson. "The whole neighborhood will be talking." "Let them," Robert said with a grin that made him look decades younger. "Gives them something to do." The drive into the city was pleasant, with Robert pointing out changes to familiar landmarks, and Martha enjoying the rare luxury of being a passenger. Usually she insisted on driving herself, but today she was content to sit back and watch the scenery pass by. "So," she said after a while, "are you going to tell me where we're really going? Or is it meant to be a surprise?" Robert's hands flexed slightly on the steering wheel. "I thought we might stop by Lux Motors." "Robert," Martha began, a note of warning in her voice. "Just to browse," he added quickly, "and maybe to introduce myself to Brad and Derek." Martha sighed, shaking her head. "I knew it. You're planning to make a scene." "Not a scene," Robert corrected. "Just a point." "And what point would that be?" "That appearances can be deceiving. That you don't treat people poorly based on assumptions." Robert's voice grew more serious. "That my wife deserves respect, regardless of what she's wearing or how old she might be." Martha felt a complicated mix of emotions. Love for this man who still rushed to her defense after all these years, embarrassment at the thought of returning to the scene of yesterday's humiliation, and a small, less noble part of her that anticipated the looks on Brad and Derek's faces when they realized their mistake. "I'm not sure this is necessary," she said, though with less conviction than before. "Maybe not," Robert acknowledged, "but it feels necessary to me." They drove in companionable silence for a while longer before Robert spoke again, his tone more reflective. "You know, when I first started out in the tech industry, no one took me seriously either. I wasn't from California, didn't have the right degree, didn't talk the right way." He smiled at a distant memory. "My first pitch meeting, the investor actually laughed me out of the room." Martha remembered those early days. The small apartment they'd shared, the long hours Robert had worked, his determination despite repeated rejections. "But you proved them wrong." "We proved them wrong," Robert corrected her. "I couldn't have done any of it without you believing in me. Taking those extra tutoring jobs so we could make rent, helping me rehearse pitches until 3 in the morning, typing up proposals on that ancient typewriter." Martha reached over to place her hand on his arm. "It was a partnership." "Still is." "Exactly," Robert said, covering her hand with his own for a moment before returning it to the wheel. "That's why this matters. Those people didn't just disrespect you yesterday, they disrespected us. Everything we've built together." Put that way, Martha found it harder to argue against Robert's plan, whatever it might be. There was something appealing about the thought of walking back into that dealership with her head held high, showing Brad and Derek just how wrong they had been. "All right," she conceded, "but promise me you'll be civil. No shouting or making threats." Robert looked offended at the suggestion. "When have I ever shouted?" "The Williams boys' bar mitzvah, 1992, Martha replied promptly. "The referee at Michael's championship game, 1988. The cable company. Too many occasions to count." Robert laughed, a deep, genuine sound that had always been one of Martha's favorite things about him. "Fair enough. I promise to be the very soul of civility." As they approached the city center, Robert made a few turns that took them away from the dealership district. Martha gave him a questioning look. "Just one stop first," he explained. "Need to pick something up." The something turned out to be 3 people waiting outside an upscale hotel. Their son Michael, daughter Patricia, and Robert's former business partner Howard Chen. All 3 were dressed formally and wore expressions that ranged from amused Howard to slightly uncomfortable Michael to downright mischievous Patricia. "What's all this?" Martha asked as Robert pulled up to the curb. "Back up," Robert replied simply, stepping out to greet their unexpected guests. Martha followed, embracing her children with genuine surprise and pleasure. Michael had flown in from Boston, where he ran a successful architectural firm, while Patricia had come from Chicago, where she was a professor at the university. "Both must have taken red-eye flights to be here so early in the day." "Mom," Michael said warmly, hugging her tight. At 48, he was the spitting image of Robert in his younger days, right down to the way he adjusted his glasses when nervous. "Dad told us what happened. Are you okay?" "I'm perfectly fine," Martha assured him, touched by his concern. "Though I don't understand why your father felt the need to drag you both across the country for this." Patricia, 3 years younger than Michael, and every bit as fiery as Martha had been in her youth, looked indignant. "Because nobody treats our mother that way and gets away with it." Howard, an elegant man in his 70s who had been Robert's closest business ally for decades, stepped forward to kiss Martha's cheek. "Your husband mentioned you had an unpleasant experience," he said diplomatically. "I thought I might be able to provide some context to the conversation he plans to have." Martha looked from Howard to Robert, understanding dawning. "The parent company," she said. "That's the connection." Howard nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Lux Motors is part of the Bergman Automotive Group. I sit on their board of directors. And you didn't think to mention this?" Martha asked Robert, who at least had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "Would you have agreed to come if I had?" he countered. Martha had to admit he had a point. Had she known the full extent of what Robert was planning, she might have put her foot down. Now, faced with her children and Howard already here, backing out seemed impossible. "Fine," she said with a sigh that didn't quite hide her reluctant anticipation. "But we're not making a spectacle. We go in, you make your point, and we leave." "Agreed?" 4 heads nodded in unison, though Martha couldn't help noticing that Patricia crossed her fingers behind her back, a childhood habit she apparently hadn't outgrown, as they all piled into the Rolls-Royce. Thankfully spacious enough to accommodate them. Comfortably, Martha found herself caught between exasperation at Robert's elaborate plan and a growing sense of warmth at the rallying of her family. There was something deeply touching about knowing they had all dropped everything to come to her defense, unnecessary though she still believed it to be. "Ready?" Robert asked as they pulled back into traffic, headed now toward Lux Motors. Martha looked around at the people she loved most in the world, all gathered together because someone had made her feel small. Suddenly she didn't feel small at all. She felt valued, cherished, and perhaps just a tiny bit eager to see the expression on Derek's face when they walked in. "Ready," she confirmed, squeezing Robert's hand. Whatever happened next, they would face it as they had faced everything else in their 50 years together, side by side. The Rolls-Royce glided into the Lux Motors parking lot just before noon, drawing immediate attention from everyone in sight. Robert bypassed the regular customer parking and pulled directly in front of the main entrance, positioning the car so that the dealership's name reflected perfectly in its polished hood. "Really, Robert?" Martha murmured, though she couldn't quite hide her amusement. "You had to park right at the door?" "Maximum visibility," Robert replied with a wink, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror. "No point making a statement if no one notices." From the back seat, Patricia leaned forward eagerly. "This is going to be good," she said, the gleam in her eye reminding Martha of when her daughter was a little girl, plotting playground revenge against boys who pulled her pigtails. "Remember," Martha cautioned, looking at each member of her family, "we're here to make a point, not create a scene. Dignity above all else." "Of course," Howard agreed smoothly, though the look he exchanged with Robert suggested they might have different definitions of dignity. As Robert helped Martha out of the car, she noticed several salespeople watching through the glass front of the showroom. The arrival of a Rolls-Royce Phantom was unusual enough, but the small entourage of well-dressed people emerging from it had clearly caught their attention. "Ready?" Robert asked quietly, offering Martha his arm. She took a deep breath and nodded, straightening her shoulders. Yesterday she had left this place feeling humiliated and small. Today would be different. The automatic doors slid open to welcome them, and Martha couldn't help but notice how different the reception was from her previous visit. The young woman at the front desk looked up immediately, her professional smile widening at the sight of such obviously wealthy potential customers. "Good morning," she greeted them, her eyes lingering appreciatively on Robert's expensive suit and Howard's gold watch. "Welcome to Lux Motors. How can we assist you today?" Robert gave her a polite nod. "We'd like to speak with Brad and Derek, please." "Of course," the receptionist replied eagerly. "May I tell them what this is regarding?" "Just say we're interested in making a substantial purchase," Howard interjected smoothly. "Multiple vehicles, in fact." The receptionist practically glowed with excitement. "I'll get them right away. Would you care for some refreshments while you wait? Coffee, water, champagne, perhaps?" "Water would be lovely," Martha said before Robert could decline, wanting a moment to collect herself. As the receptionist hurried off, Martha took in the showroom. It looked exactly as it had yesterday, the same gleaming cars, the same soft music playing in the background. Yet how different it felt to stand here now, surrounded by her family, dressed in her good clothes, arriving in a car that cost more than everything on the showroom floor. "You okay, Mom?" Michael asked quietly, noticing her pensive expression. Martha patted his hand reassuringly. Just thinking about how quickly things can change. They didn't have to wait long. The receptionist returned with a tray of water bottles, followed closely by Brad, who looked exactly as Martha remembered him. Tall, impeccably groomed, with that same practiced smile. He didn't recognize her at first, his eyes moving past her to focus on the men in the group. "Good afternoon," he said smoothly, extending his hand to Robert. "I'm Brad Wilson, senior sales consultant. I understand you're interested in multiple vehicles?" Robert took his hand, his grip perhaps a bit firmer than necessary. "Robert Wilson," he introduced himself, watching Brad's face for any reaction to the shared surname. "And yes, we are. But first, I believe you've already met my wife." Brad's eyes shifted to Martha, confusion evident in his expression for a moment before recognition dawned. His smile faltered, color draining from his face. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, his voice noticeably less confident. "And it's nice to see you again." "Is it?" Martha asked mildly. "Our last interaction gave me quite a different impression." Brad swallowed visibly, his eyes darting between Martha and the rest of the group as he began to realize his predicament. "There may have been a misunderstanding yesterday. We were extremely busy and I—" "Is Derek available?" Robert interrupted, his tone pleasant but firm. "I believe he was also involved in this misunderstanding." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Derek appeared from his office, making a beeline for the group. Unlike Brad, he didn't immediately recognize Martha. His focus was entirely on the potential big sale, his smile wide and insincere. "Welcome to Lux Motors," he boomed, hand extended. "Derek Phelps, sales manager. I understand you're looking at a fleet purchase?" Howard stepped forward, taking Derek's hand. "Howard Chen," he introduced himself, watching with hidden amusement as Derek's eyes widened in recognition of the name. "Board member, Bergman Automotive Group." Derek's smile became fixed. "Mr. Chen, this is an unexpected honor. Had we known you were visiting today, we would have prepared." "This isn't an official visit," Howard clarified. "I'm here as a friend of the Wilson family." He gestured to Robert and Martha. "I believe Mrs. Wilson visited your dealership yesterday?" Derek finally looked at Martha, really looked at her, and she saw the moment he recognized her. His ruddy face grew pale, then flushed deeply. "Mrs. Wilson," he stammered. Of course. Welcome back to Lux Motors. Martha nodded acknowledgement, keeping her expression neutral. Thank you. What a different welcome from yesterday. By now, a small crowd of other salespeople and customers had gathered at a discreet distance, drawn by the unusual scene unfolding. Derek noticed their audience and visibly struggled to maintain his composure. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office, he suggested, gesturing toward the back of the showroom. I think here is fine, Robert replied pleasantly. After all, my wife was humiliated publicly yesterday. It seems only fair that your apology should be equally public. Derek's face contorted in a grimace that might have been trying to pass for a smile. Of course, Mrs. Wilson, please accept my sincere apologies for any misunderstanding yesterday. I assure you that Lux Motors values all our customers equally. Do you? Patricia interjected, her tone skeptical. Because my mother was quite clear that she was asked to leave because you assumed she couldn't afford your vehicles. It was a busy day, Derek protested weakly. Sometimes in the rush things get said that show a person's true character. Robert suggested. I agree. Derek looked desperately toward Howard, clearly hoping for some professional courtesy. Mr. Chen, I assure you this is not how we typically conduct business. We maintain the highest standards that Bergman Automotive Group expects. Howard raised an eyebrow. Do you? Because our company policy explicitly prohibits discrimination based on age, appearance, or any other superficial factor. In fact, he added, removing a small notebook from his jacket pocket and making a show of writing something down, I'm quite interested in reviewing the customer satisfaction scores for this location. Perhaps some additional training is in order. By now, Brad looked as though he might be sick, while Derek's face had gone from red to an alarming shade of purple. The watching salespeople had edged closer, many of them looking uncomfortable or embarrassed on behalf of their colleagues. Now, Robert said, his voice calm but carrying throughout the showroom, I'd like to make something clear. My wife and I came here yesterday because we're in the market for several vehicles. One for her, one for our son who's returning from overseas, and one for our daughter's family. Michael and Patricia nodded in confirmation, both of them enjoying the growing discomfort on Brad and Derek's faces. We were prepared to spend a considerable amount of money, Robert continued. Money that will now go to one of your competitors, naturally. Mr. Wilson, Derek began desperately. I'm sure we can make this right. Perhaps a special discount. I'm not interested in a discount, Robert interrupted. I'm interested in how you treat people. All people. He looked around the showroom, making eye contact with several of the watching salespeople. The measure of a business isn't how it treats its wealthiest or most powerful customers. It's how it treats every person who walks through the door. Martha felt a surge of pride listening to her husband's words. This was the Robert she'd fallen in love with. Principled, eloquent, standing up for what was right. My wife has been buying cars since before either of you were born, Robert continued. She knows more about engines than most of your salespeople, I'd wager. She worked as a teacher for 40 years, helping shape the minds of hundreds of children. Some of them probably work in your corporate offices now. She deserves respect not because she's married to me, not because we can afford a Rolls-Royce, but because she's a human being who walked into your business with dignity and honest intentions. A heavy silence fell over the showroom. Even the background music seemed to have quieted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Derek stammered, clearly at a loss for words. Martha decided it was time to speak for herself. She stepped forward, her eyes moving between Brad and Derek. I don't want your apologies, she said clearly. I want you to think about how many other people you've misjudged and mistreated. People who didn't come back with a Rolls-Royce and a board member to make a point. She turned to the other salespeople watching the exchange. And I want all of you to remember that the person who walks in wearing gardening clothes might have more in their bank account than the one in designer suits. But more importantly, they deserve the same respect either way. Howard nodded approvingly before turning back to Derek. I'll be submitting a full report to the regional director, he said, his tone now all business. I suggest you use this as an opportunity to reevaluate how this dealership approaches customer service. Derek could only nod mutely, his career prospects visibly crumbling before his eyes. Robert checked his watch and smiled at Martha. I believe we've made our point. Shall we go? I think that bistro you like should be serving lunch by now. Martha nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted but satisfied. As they turned to leave, she paused and looked back at Brad and Derek one last time. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I hope you learn from this. Not just to save your jobs, but because it matters how we treat each other in this world." With that, the Wilson family and Howard made their way back to the Rolls-Royce, leaving behind a showroom full of stunned silence and perhaps a few important lessons. As Robert held the car door open for her, Martha caught sight of their reflection in the dealership's glass front. An elderly couple standing tall, surrounded by their loving family, the sun catching on her white hair and his silver one. Not at all the picture of wealth and power that Brad and Derek had failed to see yesterday, but something far more valuable, a portrait of dignity, integrity, and a lifetime of quiet success. "Well," Robert said as he settled into the driver's seat, "I think that went rather well, don't you?" Martha couldn't help but laugh, the tension of the confrontation finally breaking. "Yes, dear," she agreed, patting his hand. "I think it went exactly as it needed to." The small bistro on Cherry Street was busy with the lunch crowd, but the maitre d' quickly found a table for them by the window. Martha settled into her chair with a contented sigh, the tension of the morning finally leaving her shoulders. The confrontation at the dealership had been necessary, perhaps even satisfying in some ways, but it had also been exhausting. "I ordered a bottle of champagne," Robert announced as he joined the table after a brief conversation with their server. "I think we have something to celebrate." "And what might that be?" Martha asked, though she couldn't help smiling. Her husband's face was alight with the particular satisfaction that came from standing up for what was right. "Justice," Robert replied simply. "And family," he added, looking around at Michael, Patricia, and Howard with genuine affection. Patricia raised an eyebrow, her expression so much like Martha's that it often startled people who knew them both. "I'm not sure what happened back there qualifies as justice, Dad. More like karma." "Sometimes they're the same thing," Howard commented, unfolding his napkin with the careful precision that characterized everything he did. "Though I suspect Derek and Brad might have a different view on the matter. Do you think they'll lose their jobs?" Michael asked, his natural compassion showing through despite the circumstances. Even as a child, he had been the one to worry about others, to see multiple sides of every situation. Howard considered the question. "Not immediately, perhaps. But there will certainly be consequences. The regional director doesn't tolerate that kind of behavior, especially when it results in losing valuable customers." "We weren't valuable customers until they knew about the Rolls-Royce," Martha pointed out. "That's rather the problem, isn't it? People shouldn't have to prove their worth to be treated with basic respect." "Exactly," Robert agreed, reaching over to squeeze her hand, "which is why what happened today matters. It's not about punishment, it's about learning." The champagne arrived, and Robert proposed a toast. "To Martha, the most valuable person in any room she enters, no matter what she's wearing." Everyone raised their glasses, and Martha felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the champagne. These people, her family, saw her completely, valued her wholly. What Brad and Derek thought of her seemed suddenly trivial by comparison. As they settled into their meal, the conversation shifted to family matters. Michael's latest architectural project, Patricia's research, the grandchildren's activities. The incident at the dealership receded, becoming just another story in their family's long history together, until Patricia said suddenly, "Oh, I almost forgot to ask. Did you ever actually get a new car, Mom?" Martha laughed. "No, that rather got lost in all the excitement, didn't it? I still need to figure out what to do about that." "I might have a suggestion," Howard interjected, setting down his fork. "One of our other dealerships, not Lux Motors, just received a shipment of this year's hybrid models. Very efficient, excellent safety ratings. I'd be happy to make a call, have them bring a couple over to your house for you to test drive." "That's very kind," Martha began. "But I wouldn't want special treatment." "It's not special treatment," Howard assured her. "We do it for preferred customers all the time. And after 50 years of friendship, I think you and Robert more than qualify." Martha considered his offer. There was something appealing about testing cars in the comfort of her own driveway, without the pressure of a sales room or the worry of being judged. "All right," she agreed. "That would be lovely, thank you." As they finished their lunch, Robert's phone chimed with a message. He checked it, then showed the screen to Howard with raised eyebrows. Howard read the message and nodded, unsurprised. "What is it?" Martha asked, curious about their silent exchange. "Just a note from the regional director," Robert explained. "He sends his personal apologies for your experience at Lux Motors and would like to assure us that appropriate measures will be taken." "That was quick," Martha observed. "How did he even know what happened?" Howard smiled slightly. "The automotive world is surprisingly small, Martha. Word travels fast, especially when a board member shows up unexpectedly at a dealership. And when the husband of the wronged party happens to be a significant investor in the parent company," Robert added, somewhat sheepishly under Martha's sudden sharp look. "Significant investor?" Martha repeated. "When exactly were you planning to mention that detail?" Robert had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. It never seemed relevant before. Just one of many investments over the years. Martha shook her head, but there was no real annoyance behind the gesture. After 50 years of marriage, she was well accustomed to Robert's occasional surprises. His financial acumen had secured their comfortable retirement, and if he sometimes kept the details to himself, well, that was just Robert's way. After lunch, they said goodbye to Howard, who had a board meeting to attend. Michael and Patricia decided to stay an extra day, a rare treat for Martha and Robert, who didn't get to see their children as often as they would like. The four of them spent the afternoon together, walking through the downtown area, window shopping, and catching up on family news. By the time they returned home, evening was settling in. Michael and Patricia went to prepare the guest rooms they had used growing up, while Martha and Robert sat together on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Quite a day," Robert commented, his arm around Martha's shoulders. "Quite a day," she agreed, leaning into his familiar warmth. "Though not at all what I expected when I went car shopping yesterday," Robert chuckled. "Life rarely goes as expected. That's what keeps it interesting." They rocked in comfortable silence for a while, the old swing creaking rhythmically before Martha spoke again. "You know, there's something I've been wondering." "What's that?" "If I had gone to that dealership dressed in designer clothes, driving a luxury car to begin with, would Brad and Derek have treated me differently?" Robert considered the question. "Probably," he admitted. "People like that often do. And if they had been respectful and attentive simply because they thought I could afford their cars, would that really have been any better? Their judgment would still have been based on appearance, just a different kind of appearance." Robert nodded slowly, understanding her point. "True respect isn't conditional," he said. "It's extended to everyone regardless of what they can or can't provide in return." "Exactly," Martha said softly. "I keep thinking about how many people walk into places like that every day and get dismissed because they don't look right and they don't have a Robert Wilson with a Rolls-Royce to come back and make a point." Robert tightened his arm around her. "Does this mean you're planning to become a consumer advocate in your retirement? Taking on disrespectful salespeople across the city?" Martha laughed. "Maybe not quite that dramatic, but I think I might have a letter to write to the local paper about judgment and appearances and treating people with dignity." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Robert said. "Your letters always did get results. Remember when you took on the school board about cutting the music program? They restored the funding within a week," Martha recalled with satisfaction. "The power of well-chosen words," Robert said proudly. "More effective than showing up in a Rolls-Royce in the long run," Martha smiled. "Though the Rolls-Royce certainly made for a more dramatic moment." "That it did," Robert agreed, chuckling. The look on Derek's face when Howard introduced himself. "I wish I'd had a camera." As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, they heard Michael and Patricia talking and laughing inside the house. The sounds of family that had always made their house a home. Tomorrow, Howard's colleague would bring cars for Martha to test drive. Life would go on, this incident becoming just another story to tell at family gatherings. But something had changed, subtly but significantly. Martha felt it in herself. A renewed determination not to be invisible, not to be diminished by others' perceptions. She had spent decades teaching children to stand up for themselves and for what was right. Perhaps it was time to remind herself of those same lessons. A week later, Martha's letter appeared in the city newspaper. It didn't mention names or specific businesses, but it spoke eloquently about respect, dignity, and the danger of judging others based on appearances. It concluded with a gentle reminder that every person deserves to be seen and valued, regardless of age, attire, or affluence. The letter generated dozens of responses, many from older readers who had experienced similar treatment. The newspaper ran a follow-up feature on ageism in customer service. A local business association organized a workshop on inclusive customer practices, small ripples of change spreading outward from one woman's experience. As for Lux Motors, significant changes followed in the wake of the Wilsons' visit. Derek was transferred to a smaller dealership in a neighboring state, a lateral move that nonetheless sent a clear message. Brad was required to complete extensive customer service training and placed on probation. Most importantly, the dealership implemented new policies to ensure all customers received equal treatment and respect. Signs appeared in the employee break room. "We don't judge books by their covers or customers by their clothes." Martha eventually chose a practical, fuel-efficient sedan from Howard's recommended dealership. The salesperson who helped her, a pleasant woman in her 50s, treated her with genuine respect and never once mentioned the incident that had become something of a legend in local car sales circles. Sometimes, when Martha drove her new car past Lux Motors, she would smile to herself, not with vindication but with hope that perhaps a small lesson had been learned, not just by Brad and Derek, but by anyone who heard the story of an elderly woman who was judged by her appearance one day and returned the next with a Rolls-Royce and her dignity intact. In the end, it wasn't about the car at all. It was about being seen for who she truly was, not just Robert's wife, not just a woman in gardening clothes, but Martha Wilson, teacher, mother, grandmother, and person of worth, regardless of what anyone else might think.